There's something that happens to a man somewhere in his 40s or 50s that almost nobody talks about. Not because it's secret, but because the men it happens to have quietly stopped explaining themselves. You've probably felt it. A gradual loosening of something you used to hold tightly. A slow reduction in effort that you didn't consciously decide to make. The world around you kept moving at the same pace. Women kept expecting the same things. But something inside you had already done the math, arrived at a different answer, and moved on without making any announcement. The people around you noticed. They just couldn't name what they were seeing. And here's the part that matters. Neither could you. Most men at this stage know that something has shifted, but they don't have a clear picture of what actually changed, why it changed when it did, and what it means for every relationship moving forward. That is what this video is going to give you. By the time we are done, you will have language for something you have felt for years. You will understand exactly why the women in your life are only now beginning to notice what changed, and why their response to it almost never matches what is actually happening inside you. For most of your adult life, you were running a program you didn't write. You were told, not in words, but in outcomes, exactly what you needed to do to be acceptable to women. And for a long time, you ran that program. Most men do. It started early, before you had the vocabulary to question it. You learned that male value was demonstrated, that you showed up, showed interest, showed effort, and that the return on all of that showing was access. Access to connection, access to approval, access to the feeling that you were enough. The demonstration was exhausting, of course, but you didn't frame it as exhaustion at the time. You framed it as ambition, or as caring, or simply as what men do. You dressed it up, you made it work. And in your 20s and 30s, the system produced enough results that you kept running it without examining whether it was actually working, or whether it was simply familiar. What nobody told you was that the program had a cost that accumulated invisibly. Every time you edited what you said to manage her reaction, there was a small withdrawal. Every time you suppressed your own preferences to keep the peace, another withdrawal. Every time you performed interest you didn't fully feel, or held back frustration that had every right to exist, or made yourself smaller to fit a space that should have welcomed you at full size, the account got quieter. You weren't tracking it, but it was tracking itself. And one day, without ceremony, the balance reached a number that changed everything. But programs don't run forever, and at some point, quietly, without announcement, something in you started questioning the return on that investment. It wasn't a breakup. It wasn't a betrayal. For most men, there was no single moment they can point to. There was just a morning, maybe several mornings, where the effort of trying simply felt optional in a way it never had before. That's the detail most people miss when they try to explain why older men seem to disengage from the pursuit of female attention. They reach for dramatic explanations, a painful divorce, a midlife collapse, some wound that calcified into indifference. And sometimes those things are part of the picture, but more often the real answer is far quieter and far more universal than that. What happened was arithmetic, not emotional damage, not bitterness, not a decision made in anger. Just a slow, private calculation that one day produced a different result than it always had before. The psychologist Roy Baumeister spent years researching what he called the social exchange architecture of male behavior. The way men, more than women, tend to evaluate relationships through an implicit cost-benefit lens that runs beneath conscious awareness. What his research pointed to was not that men are transactional in a cynical sense, but that the male orientation toward effort is deeply tied to perceived reciprocity. When the sense of return on emotional investment drops below a certain threshold, not suddenly but gradually, over years, the motivation to sustain the investment restructures itself. It doesn't vanish, it reallocates. That is the shift, not a closing, a reallocation. And once that shift happens, the way a man moves through the world changes in ways that are visible to everyone around him, even if they can't name what they're seeing. Women tend to notice the withdrawal before they notice the reason for it. And almost universally, they interpret it through a lens that centers their own experience, which means they almost always get it wrong. The most common interpretation is that something happened. that he is punishing someone or recovering from someone or hiding something. The second most common interpretation is depression, the assumption that a man who has become quieter, less available, less eager to initiate, must be struggling internally. And the third, perhaps the most flattering to the woman doing the interpreting, is that he simply needs the right person to open him back up. All three of these readings share the same root error. They assume that the change is about a deficit, that something was lost, removed, or damaged, and that the restoration of whatever is missing would return him to his previous state. But you know better than that, because you have felt it from the inside. The change is not about loss. It is about arrival. Of course, context matters here. There are men for whom withdrawal does signal pain, men who are genuinely isolated, who have confused self-protection with self-sufficiency. That distinction is real and it matters. But for the man who has done the internal work, who has arrived at this stage through accumulation rather than collapse, what looks like distance from the outside is something else entirely on the inside. What looks like indifference from the outside is rarely indifference. It's something much more specific. And understanding what it actually is changes everything about how you interpret your own behavior. There's a word people reach for when they see this in a man: unavailable. But unavailable implies something is missing. What's actually happening is closer to the opposite. The concept here, and I want to explain this carefully because it tends to get misunderstood, is what developmental psychologists refer to as selective presence. It is not emotional unavailability, which describes a deficit in the capacity for connection. It is something fundamentally different, a restructuring of access. The man is present. His capacity for depth, for warmth, for genuine intimacy has not diminished. What has changed is the threshold at which he extends that presence automatically. In earlier life, access was relatively open. It was granted by proximity, by interest shown, by a woman's approval signaling that effort was warranted. The gate was low, and most people who approached it could walk through. What happens in the second half of life, for men who have moved through this shift, is that the gate relocates. It doesn't lock, but it moves. And it now requires something more specific than proximity or interest to open. Think back to a relationship or dynamic where you felt you were doing most of the reaching, where your effort was consistent and her reciprocation was inconsistent, and you kept adjusting your effort to try to close the gap. Now notice how different your orientation would be to that same dynamic today. Not angrier, not more wounded, simply less willing to perform the adjustment. That quiet shift in willingness, that is selective presence. You are not closed, you are specific. You might wonder, is this the same as becoming guarded? And the honest answer is, it can become that if the shift happens through bitterness rather than clarity. But when it happens through clarity, it produces something that looks remarkably similar from the outside, but feels entirely different from the inside. Bitterness is loud internally, even when it is silent externally. Clarity is quiet in both directions. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of women, because the thing that used to work simply doesn't anymore. And what does work now is almost nothing like what they were taught. The strategies that made sense when he was 28, when his self-worth was still partially outsourced to female attention, those strategies are hitting a different operating system now. Withdrawal to trigger pursuit worked when his sense of value was calibrated externally. When he needed to be chosen to feel secure, the threat of being unchosen was enough to move him. But the man who has arrived at internal calibration does not experience the withdrawal as a threat. He experiences it as a signal that the dynamic has confirmed what his instinct already told him. Emotional escalation presents a similar mismatch, raising the emotional stakes to generate a response, increasing intensity, introducing urgency, manufacturing crisis, produces a predictable effect on a younger man whose nervous system is still oriented toward managing female emotional states. It produces a very different effect on a man who has learned, through decades of accumulated experience, that emotional escalation is not information. It is weather. He does not dismiss it. He simply waits for it to pass before deciding whether there is something real underneath it. Social proof strategies. The suggestion that other men find her compelling, that attention is available elsewhere, operate on scarcity logic. And scarcity logic requires that the target feel a deficit. It requires him to want more than he currently has. The man who has reached genuine self-sufficiency is not immune to attraction, but he is largely immune to scarcity pressure. The information that she has other options produces in him something close to indifference. Not performance indifference, but actual indifference, because his sense of adequacy is not housed in whether she chooses him. None of this is framed as criticism of women who use these strategies. They were taught to use them. They produced results for decades. The miscalculation is not moral, it is temporal. The woman using a 2005 map to navigate 2025 territory is not wrong to trust the map. The map is simply outdated. Which brings us to the part of this that most women never reach, because most women stop trying before they ever discover what actually gets through. It's not that he's closed, it's that the door is in a different place than it used to be. And most women are still knocking on the wall. What gets through to a man at this stage is not a strategy. That is the first thing to understand, and it is also the thing that makes this genuinely difficult to teach. Any behavior that originates from strategy, from calculation about what will produce a desired result, tends to register as noise rather than signal. Not because he is unusually perceptive, but because a man who has spent decades navigating performed interest has developed a very finely calibrated sensor for the difference between presence and agenda. What actually lands is directness without performance. Not bluntness for its own sake, but the specific quality of someone saying exactly what they mean without adjusting it to manage his reaction. You would think this would be obvious. You would think most people operate this way. But the reality is that most social communication, especially in early romantic or relational contexts, is heavily managed. People say versions of what they mean. They calibrate. They leave exits. The man at this stage notices the calibration. And when he encounters someone who has abandoned it, who says what they actually think, who asks what they actually want to know, who sits with him without performing comfort, something in him recognizes it. Not as a strategy, as a quality. This is the signal that almost never gets discussed. Not the grand gesture, not the physical signal, not the pursuit or withdrawal or escalation. It is the texture of unmanaged presence, the experience of being with someone who is not performing at you, who is not running a program of their own. The women who reach men at this stage tend to share this quality, and it is almost never about appearance, age, or social status. It is about register, about whether or not there is a performance between you. Remember what I mentioned at the start, that there was something shifting inside men at this stage that the people around them could feel but not name. The final layer of that shift is what we are arriving at now. And once you see it, it changes how you read every interaction you have had with women in the last decade, and every interaction you will have going forward. But there's one final layer to this, and it's the part that surprises people the most. Because it's not about what women do, it's about what this man has discovered about himself. Here is what nobody tells you about a man who has stopped needing to be chosen. And it's the part that tends to confuse the people watching from the outside most. The assumption is that he must be lonely, that behind the stillness and the selectivity, there is a man who simply has not found the right person to want him, and that the settled quality he projects is a coping mechanism rather than an actual state. This assumption is not malicious, it is just wrong. The man on the other side of this shift does not experience his internal state as a waiting room. He experiences it as a room he has finally furnished. This is not the quiet of deprivation. It is the quiet of someone who has stopped filling silence with noise that didn't serve him. The hobbies that were abandoned in the years of performing for approval get reclaimed, not as consolation prizes, but as genuine sources of engagement. The friendships that were let lapse under the weight of romantic maintenance get rebuilt, slowly and on different terms. The relationship with his own time changes fundamentally. He discovers that the hours he used to spend managing female emotional states were hours he can now spend inside his own experience, and that his own experience, when given full attention, is more interesting than he remembered. Now, you might resist this characterization. You might think, this sounds like rationalization, like a man talking himself into being content with less. And I would ask you to sit with that objection for a moment before dismissing what comes next. Because here is the paradox that closes this entire picture. The men who have arrived at this internal settledness, the men least oriented toward female approval, least invested in being chosen, consistently report that they attract more genuine interest from women than they did during the decades they were actively performing for it. Not more flattery, not more pursuit, more genuine interest. The specific quality of a woman who is actually curious about who he is, as opposed to who he might become if she manages him correctly. Neither side fully understands why this happens. But the mechanism is not mysterious once you name it. A man who requires nothing projects something that is extraordinarily rare in the social landscape: the absence of agenda. And in a world where almost every interaction carries an undercurrent of someone wanting something from someone else, the man who genuinely does not need anything from you is immediately and unmistakably different. The paradox. Why the men who seem least available tend to attract the most genuine interest is exactly what leads to the question that comes next. And so here is where everything we have covered settles into one picture. What you now understand, and what most people watching a man move through this shift will never understand, is that the change is not a closing. It is a clarification. The decades of performing for external approval were not wasted. They were the data. They were the accumulation that eventually produced a different answer. The man who stops trying is not the man who gave up. He is the man who finally stopped confusing effort with value. You do not need to perform your worth to anyone who requires the performance as proof. That is the simplest version of everything this video has covered. You do not need to run the program. The program was always optional. It just took a certain number of years to feel that clearly. What you have now is something that cannot be taught to a younger version of you and cannot be rushed into existence. It arrived through accumulation. It is yours. This doesn't mean you become unavailable to genuine connection. It means you become available only to the real version of it. And that distinction, once you feel it from the inside, is everything. You will not need to analyze every interaction. You will not need to decode behavior or track signals. The clarity you have developed will do that work quietly in the background. Trust it. I want to know one thing from you in the comments. Was there a specific moment, or was it a slow accumulation, when you noticed this shift in yourself? Tell me how it happened. I read every comment on this channel, and this is the kind of question where the answers tend to be genuinely worth reading. If what you heard today reflected something real in your experience, the subscribe button is there for a reason, because this channel is going to keep going deeper into these dynamics, and the next video is one you will not want to miss. In the next video, I'm going to show you the moment most women realize they waited too long, what that recognition looks like, what they do next, and whether any of it actually changes anything. That one is worth staying for.